John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He wasn't just a president, he was a spectacle, a walking myth crafted in smoke and light, the perfect husband, the war hero with tousled hair and a killer smile, a new kind of American power, one that didn't need to shout. It could seduce. When John F. Kennedy stepped into the White House in 1961, he brought with him not just policies and politics, but a promise that greatness could be graceful, that power could be beautiful. It was a lie. The truth was kept off camera, locked behind hotel doors, whispered through hallways, filed into drawers labeled personal. He was not what the public saw, not really. The president who stood for liberty and honor also prowled hallways looking for girls, teenagers, secretaries, daughters of donors, interns, babes, as his men called them. He didn't ask, he didn't wait, he took, and when he was finished, he walked away. The myth of JFK was not born, it was engineered. Hollywood lit him, Harvard groomed him, the press, the church, the government, they all played their part. Behind the velvet rope of Camelot stood a man who believed his charm was consent, and that nothing, not law, not conscience, not fear, could touch him. And for a while, nothing did. He had help, of course. Trusted aides like Dave Powers, who summoned girls like room service. Secret Service men who turned their backs. Editors who killed stories. His brother, the Attorney General, who made sure certain names never went public. Even the CIA would later get involved, not to expose, but to clean up. But this isn't a story about power in the abstract. It's about the girls, the young women who never made the history books. Some of them barely made it out. One was a virgin from Wheaton College, dazzled by the idea of doing good in Washington, who was ushered into the First Lady's bedroom and told to smile. Another was a 20-year-old Radcliffe student who thought he loved her, until she realized she was only ever a secret. Another was found dead with 2 bullets in her skull and a diary that vanished into CIA hands. One delivered sealed envelopes between the president and the mob. Another was hired to work for the First Lady and ended up in the president's bed. They were real. They had names. They had lives. And one by one they were rewritten, erased, or broken. This is not revisionist history. It is the history that was always there, if you were willing to look behind the light. Because to understand who John F. Kennedy really was, you have to understand what he did when the cameras weren't rolling and when the door was closed, when the girl said nothing. And that is where our story begins. She was 19, still wearing her Wheaton College innocence like a second skin. Her hair was neat, her voice quiet, her faith in institutions intact. She had come to Washington to do what good girls did in 1962: serve, learn, observe. She never imagined she would become a secret, a statistic, a ghost. Her name was Mimi Beardsley. 4 days after arriving as a White House intern, she was invited to a pool party, one of the private ones. No cameras, no chaperones. Just the president, a few hand-picked aides, and a fresh rotation of young women whose names were scribbled on secret memos and quietly passed between staffers. She didn't swim. She didn't drink. She smiled when spoken to. And then someone came for her. Dave Powers, the president's fixer, the man who always knew what Kennedy wanted before Kennedy said a word, took her gently by the elbow and led her upstairs, past portraits, past guards, past everything that had ever felt safe. He brought her into the First Lady's bedroom and closed the door. President John F. Kennedy was waiting. He was 45, married, a war hero, the leader of the free world. And in the seconds that followed, he became something else. A man who took what he wanted because he knew no one would stop him. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She froze, just long enough for him to close the distance, for the enormity of the moment to eclipse her instincts. It was her first time, and he didn't ask. In her memoir, she would later write, "I wouldn't call it the R word, but it wasn't consent either." What followed wasn't an affair. It was an arrangement. He summoned her, sometimes to the White House, sometimes to hotels, once to the Carlisle. He never kissed her on the mouth. He made crude jokes. He never asked what she wanted and gave her pills once, just to see how she'd react. One night in the swimming pool room, with Dave Powers watching, Kennedy suggested she perform oral S on his aid. She was still a teenager. She did, then cried. He laughed it off. There were no promises, no romance, only instructions. She was not a lover, but an assignment. And when she wasn't needed anymore, when the presidency grew darker, the threats closer, she simply stopped being summoned. Then he died and she married and buried it all. For 40 years, she told no one. Not her husband, not her children, not herself. When people spoke of Kennedy with reverence, she smiled and nodded. When they called him a great man, she said nothing. And then, decades later, her name was found in Kennedy's archives. A reporter called, and the secret couldn't be contained anymore. In 2011, she released Once Upon a Secret, the memoir that finally dragged the fantasy of Camelot into the light. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. The backlash came fast. It was just the times, people said. She must have wanted it. He was a president. What do you expect? What no one said, what too few ever asked, was, what does it do to a girl to be used by a god and then thrown into the crowd as if she never mattered? This wasn't seduction or romance. It was calculated access. Mimi Beardsley's story was the blueprint for what would happen to others. Girls who came to Washington with their futures in front of them and walked away carrying something else entirely. Guilt that wasn't theirs. Shame that didn't belong to them. And silence they never agreed to. Diana DeVegh followed. She wasn't from nowhere. She wasn't a wide-eyed intern sent to fetch coffee. Diana DeVegh was a 20-year-old Radcliffe student, bright, earnest, full of ideas about justice and change. She had been raised to admire leaders, to believe in ideals. And when she met John F. Kennedy, she believed she was meeting a man who embodied both. He was a senator on his way to the presidency. He found her in a crowd at a campaign event. Their eyes met and the world shifted. Or at least hers did. Later, an aide approached. "The senator would like to see you." The first meeting felt like destiny. He listened. He smiled. He made her feel chosen. She was flattered. Who wouldn't be? He was handsome, famous, powerful, and she, just a student. What followed was 4 years of shadows. He controlled everything. Where they met, when and how, always on his terms, always secret. Hotels, borrowed apartments, private rooms that no one would ever associate with a president. She was never seen in public with him, never invited to the places where he smiled for the cameras. He didn't want her at his side, only within reach. At first, Diana thought it was love. She convinced herself that the secrecy was intimacy, that being hidden meant being treasured, that the little pieces of his time she was given meant something real. At the time, I thought I was special. Now I know I was just convenient. That realization didn't come until decades later. At the time, she rationalized. She forgave the dismissiveness, the sudden silences, the endless hiding, because she was young and because she had been taught to see men like him as gods. I didn't realize for a very long time that I had been invisible to him the whole time. And when it was over, there was no goodbye, no closure, no explanation, just absence. When it ended, there was no conversation. I simply stopped being invited. she was erased, not with cruelty, but with indifference. For years, Diana carried the weight alone. She told no one. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't have the language to explain what had happened. The world saw him as a hero. Who would listen? It took decades, and the rise of movements that finally questioned what power does to consent, before she found her voice. And when she did, she spoke not with anger, but with clarity. She wrote, at last, what history had tried to forget. He had the power. I had the fantasy. Then came Mary Pinchot Meyer. She wasn't dazzled by power. She had grown up inside it. She was a painter, an intellectual, the ex-wife of a top CIA official. In other lives, she'd been a pacifist, an LSD experimenter, a student of Timothy Leary, a woman decades ahead of her time. She was not naive, but even she didn't see it coming. She met Jack Kennedy at a Georgetown dinner. They had known each other since prep school days. But this was different. He was now the President of the United States. And she, ethereal, artistic, fearless, was exactly the kind of challenge that thrilled him. He was married. She didn't care. He was reckless. She didn't flinch. They began an affair sometime in 1962, a year before his death. But this was no ordinary affair. It was philosophical, political, chemical. Meyer brought ideas into the White House that Kennedy's handlers hated. Anti-war conversations, civil rights discussions, drugs. She gave him marijuana and allegedly gave him LSD. She asked him questions that weren't about sex or secrets, but about morality. But somewhere along the way, Mary Pinchot Meyer began to change. She saw too much and started writing a diary. Then, JFK was killed. And less than a year later, so was she. On October 12, 1964, a bright morning in Washington, D.C., Meyer left her Georgetown home for a walk along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Trail, never to return. Her body was found beside the water. 2 shots, execution style, one to the head, one to the chest. No robbery or assault or reason. The man arrested, a black laborer named Ray Crump, had no weapon and no clear connection. He was acquitted. But that's not the end of it, and that's not even the scariest part. Hours after Mary's death, James Jesus Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence and a close friend of her ex-husband Cord Meyer, broke into her home. He rifled through her studio looking for the diary. He wasn't the only one. Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post and also Meyer's brother-in-law, later wrote that he and his wife, Toni, found Angleton with a skeleton key in hand, already inside the house. Bradley took the diary and later turned it over to Angleton. It was never seen again. Why would the CIA be so desperate to seize the private musings of a dead artist? Friends close to Meyer believed she had grown suspicious, not just of Kennedy's death, but of the machine around him, the military, the intelligence community, the quiet erasure of idealism that JFK once claimed to uphold. Meyer wasn't just a lover, she was a witness, and witnesses in that world didn't get to talk. Her death was written off as random, senseless, a tragedy. But those who knew her said otherwise. They said she had been speaking of writing a book and telling the truth about Jack, his secrets, and the darkness that consumed him and the men who surrounded him. In another life, Mary Pinchot Meyer might have been the one to rip the veil off Camelot. She might have been the first to say, "The emperor has no soul." But she died alone on a quiet trail, with a bullet in her brain and a nation too enchanted to ask why. Then there was Judith Campbell. She thought it was just sex at first. Glamour, maybe. Proximity to danger. Campbell was 26 when she met John F. Kennedy. He was a rising senator with a legendary family name, already orbiting the presidency. She was beautiful, stylish, and unafraid. The kind of woman who could keep a secret. But no one told her what she was stepping into. They met in Las Vegas. The introduction was arranged by Frank Sinatra, whose parties blurred the lines between politics, entertainment, and crime. Judith was already having an affair with Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago outfit. She liked powerful men and they liked her more. But John was different. He sent her flowers, called her from secure lines, flew her to Washington and slipped her past guards and press. She stayed at the Hay Adams Hotel under fake names. When they met, he always made sure there were no photos, no paper trails, just her, the room, and silence. At first, she thought she mattered, but it didn't take long before the tone shifted. He started asking favors. Could she deliver an envelope to Sammy? Just a message, maybe 2. Could she fly somewhere short notice? Could she be discreet if anyone asked? She didn't understand what she had become. Not just a mistress, but a courier between the President of the United States and the American Mafia. Judith Campbell Exner was suddenly living a spy thriller, with no map and no protection. She delivered envelopes she never opened. She carried messages between the White House and Giancana, sometimes relayed through Johnny Rosselli, another mobster tangled up in the CIA's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. She was the connective tissue in one of the darkest, most dangerous triangles in American history: politics, sex, and organized crime. But when the spotlight came, when the truth threatened to emerge, she was the only one without cover. In the 1970s, Senate investigators uncovered her name. She was called to testify and the story exploded. She denied the affair at first, then admitted to it, then told reporters she had been pressured to lie. Her story changed, not because she was dishonest, but because she was terrified. Everyone else had power. She had only the truth, and the truth had become a liability. She was hounded by the media, discredited by Kennedy loyalists, labeled unstable. Her health collapsed and was soon diagnosed with cancer. Through pain and fear, she kept writing letters, kept trying to explain what had happened. In one interview, her voice thin and shaking, she said, "I was in way over my head. I wasn't a spy. I was a girl. And they used me." History didn't thank her for the confession. It dismissed her as a fringe figure, too compromised, too inconsistent, too embarrassing. But the evidence, well, it stayed. The FBI confirmed the White House phone calls. The flight logs matched her claims. The dates she mentioned aligned with mafia meetings under surveillance. The CIA refused to comment. She wasn't lying. She was just inconvenient. Judith Campbell Exner died in 1999, almost completely forgotten. No headlines or retrospectives, no reappraisals. But she was the woman who knew everything, and she lived long enough to realize that knowing everything meant no one would believe you. She wasn't the only one who was used, then discarded. Judith had been a courier, Mary a threat, Mimi a secret. But there was another, one who sat just feet from the First Lady's office, wearing pearls, taking press calls, and slipping silently into the president's world after hours. She never wrote a book or gave an interview, but she was there, always there. If proximity is power, then Pamela Turner was dangerously close to the sun. She was 23 years old, poised, beautiful, and sharp. The first ever press secretary assigned to a First Lady. Her office was just outside Jackie Kennedy's suite. She was supposed to handle social calls, schedule garden tours, coordinate interviews. Instead, she became the president's shadow. No headlines or gossip columns, and no scandal, because Pamela Turner didn't speak, and no one dared speak for her. But behind the White House walls, everyone knew. According to multiple Secret Service accounts, Turner was seen exiting the president's bedroom late at night. Staffers whispered. There were rumors of closed-door meetings that extended, past midnight. Rumors of gifts, favors, and silences exchanged like currency. Unlike other women in JFK's orbit, Pamela worked inside the machine. She didn't enter through a hotel elevator or a side door at the Carlyle. She sat at a desk and filed official statements. And when Kennedy buzzed her, when the President of the United States wanted his secretary to come in, she came. What was she supposed to do? Say no? He was the president, her boss, her protector, her captor. Some say it began during the campaign before he even took office. Others place it later, after Jackie grew distant and the facade of a happy marriage became a matter of political necessity. Either way, Turner became the fallback, the convenience, the woman who wouldn't talk because she couldn't, because to speak would be to lose everything. She was replaced in Jackie's office in 1963 with no explanation, just months before Kennedy's death. No farewell, just reassignment. History swept her name aside like it did so many others, quietly and deliberately. But in the years that followed, her name kept surfacing. In Vanity Fair pieces, in whispered footnotes of Kennedy biographies, in briefings from former agents who saw more than they ever said. And it was always the same conclusion: she had been there and no one cared. There was no memoir, interviews, or corrections. She stayed loyal, even when it cost her. Maybe she thought it was love. Maybe it was survival. Maybe both. But when Kennedy died, no one asked how it felt to lose someone you couldn't even admit you'd had. Pamela Turner's silence wasn't complicity, but consequence. She had learned what every woman around Kennedy eventually learned, that your usefulness ends the second you become visible. The violence, the entitlement, the taste for young women didn't start with Jack. They were inherited, learned, practiced, passed down like cufflinks or liquor bottles or war stories. John F. Kennedy wasn't an outlier. He was the crown prince of a kingdom where power meant possession and women were the cost of doing business. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., built the empire, and he built it on the same rules that would govern every Kennedy son after him. Charm buys silence, wealth cleans everything, and the rules do not apply to you. Joe Kennedy was no gentleman. Behind the suits and the Catholic guilt was a man with a predator's instinct and a banker's precision. He had affairs, flagrantly and constantly, and expected his wife to look away. He treated women like investments, useful for leverage, discardable after interest. In Hollywood, they whispered about him and Gloria Swanson, the legendary actress who became his business partner, then his victim. According to her own memoir, he raped her, then continued managing her career as if nothing had happened. She let it go. What else could she do? He controlled the money and the press. Jack learned early. By prep school, he was already slipping girls into his dorm. By Harvard, he was already learning how to get what he wanted without leaving fingerprints. And once he had the presidency, there were no more barriers, just a rotating door of nameless women and well-compensated enablers. But he wasn't alone. His brother Bobby learned too. Bobby Kennedy always seemed like the good one, the loyal brother, the moral center, the boy who knelt at mass, who fought for civil rights, who carried the torch after Dallas. But that was the public Bobby, the man the cameras loved. The private Bobby was more complicated. He learned the same lessons as Jack. That charm was a weapon, that power made desire a right, that women were part of the machinery, useful, silent, and disposable. Bobby's private life had shadows. Marilyn Monroe wasn't the only woman who'd been used and abandoned by him and his brother. She was simply the most visible, the one whose fame made her fall impossible to hide. Behind her were countless others, less famous, less protected, but no less broken by their encounters with power that disguised itself as affection. Whispers followed him in the corridors of power, secretaries, socialites, actresses drawn to the intensity of his grief after Jack's death, the quiet magnetism of a man who seemed both powerful and wounded. Bobby Kennedy was the quiet executor of the Kennedy machine's most ruthless lesson. When a woman threatens the myth, she disappears. He wasn't as reckless as Jack, but he wasn't innocent. And above all, Bobby's greatest affair was with the protection of the Kennedy name. He used the FBI, the Secret Service, his own office. He made sure certain calls went unanswered, certain files stayed buried, certain women stayed quiet. When Marilyn died, he didn't grieve. He disappeared. And history let him. Because Bobby Kennedy's greatest talent wasn't seduction. It was erasure. Then there was Ted. You can't talk about the Kennedy name without speaking of Chappaquiddick. Mary Jo Kopechne wasn't supposed to be a headline. She wasn't supposed to be a martyr. She was a bright, capable 28-year-old political staffer, hard-working, idealistic, the kind of woman who believed that public service meant something. A daughter of modest means, who'd earned her place among the powerful through talent, not connections. She wasn't looking for a spotlight. She wasn't looking for scandal. And then came the night of July 18th, 1969. A party on Chappaquiddick Island. Ted Kennedy inebriated at the wheel, with Mary Jo in the passenger seat. A narrow bridge, then a sharp turn, and the car plunged into the dark water. What happened in that car in the final moments before it went under? No one knows but Ted. And he never really told. He escaped, swam to shore, walked past houses with lit windows. He passed phones he could have used to call for help. But he didn't. He went back to his hotel, changed his clothes, and went to bed. 9 hours passed before authorities were notified. By then, it was too late. Mary Jo was dead, still trapped in the overturned car. When they found her, she had been trapped in a shrinking pocket of air, maybe 3 inches of breath left between her and the end. She hadn't died on impact. She had waited, hoped, fought, and he had left. The Kennedy machine spun into motion, a sympathetic judge, a suspended sentence for leaving the scene of an accident. No real investigation into what Mary Jo might have endured in those final hours. No deeper inquiry into why a US senator abandoned a drowning woman and tried to salvage his own future instead. The press framed it as a tragedy, a sad mistake, a burden Ted would carry forever. But it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a blueprint. Protect the name, minimize the woman, move on. Mary Jo's life was reduced to a single night, a single headline, a single whispered rumor. Her hopes, her work, her voice, all drowned in that car alongside her. And Ted? He returned to public life. He gave speeches. He kept the name intact. His career bent, but did not break. Because in the world of the Kennedys, it wasn't the woman who mattered. It was the myth. In the years that followed, the family scandals multiplied like shadows. Michael Kennedy, son of RFK, caught in a multi-year sexual relationship with a 14-year-old babysitter. The family spun it, the press softened it, the case disappeared. William Kennedy Smith, nephew of John, son of Jean Kennedy Smith, was out drinking with his uncle Ted. They met a young woman. She was polite, a local, charmed by the attention, flattered by the Kennedy glow. She agreed to join them back at the family's beachfront estate. Maybe she thought it would be fun. Maybe she thought it would be safe. It wasn't. What happened next would become one of the most high-profile trials of the decade. The woman said Smith attacked her, dragged her onto the lawn, and raped her. Medical evidence supported her claim. Trauma consistent with assault, torn clothing, bruises. But the Kennedy machine kicked in. Character assassination, legal maneuvering, silence. Obviously, he was acquitted. After the trial, William Kennedy Smith receded from the national spotlight. He built a new image for himself, a doctor, a humanitarian, dedicating his work to helping victims of landmines through the non-profit Center for International Rehabilitation. But the shadow followed him. In 2004, a woman who worked as his assistant at the center accused him of sexual assault and filed a lawsuit. The case never made it to trial. A judge dismissed it, and the Kennedy name kept its shield intact. Each story followed the same script: a young woman, a powerful man, a cover-up, and then nothing. No accountability or apology, just another marble bust in another family library, another quote about service and sacrifice carved into stone. But the truth was rotting behind the legacy, and anyone who tried to pull back the curtain was met with denial, disdain, or destruction. The Kennedy myth endures because it was designed to. Built on photo ops, protected by publishers, airbrushed in real time by men who believed that history belonged to the winners. But behind the speeches, behind the charities, behind the graves and eternal flames, there was a different inheritance. A family business built on other people's silence. And the girls, the interns, the babysitters, the secretaries, they were the raw material, the parts no one counted, the parts no one remembered. And all the while, the journalists, the editors, the columnists who printed the Camelot headlines and posed with their press passes like shields knew it all along. They knew who John F. Kennedy really was. They knew about the girls, about the parties, about the bodies shuffled in and out of hotels like ghost deliveries. They knew, and they said nothing. They called it professionalism, decorum, respect for the office. But the truth is simpler. It was a deal. You protect the myth, we protect your career. The White House of the early 1960s wasn't just a seat of power, but a stage. And the media played their part, carefully positioned photographers, pre-approved questions, glowing profiles of Jackie's fashion and Jack's youthful vitality. There were no headlines about what was happening behind the curtains, and no mention of the interns, the secretaries, the tears. Ben Bradlee knew. He was one of the president's closest friends, later the editor of the Washington Post and a gatekeeper of political journalism. He suspected JFK was sleeping with Mary Pinchot Meyer, his wife's best friend. He wrote about it years later, but at the time he said nothing. And he wasn't alone. The Time Bureau, the Life magazine editors, the stringers who traveled with the president on Air Force One and saw women led to back entrances of hotels, they all knew. They called it discretion. But it was cowardice, or worse, collaboration. Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, ran the show like a producer. He knew which reporters could be trusted not to ask questions, which photographers wouldn't snap the wrong shot, which columns needed a nudge. Journalists who played along were rewarded with quotes, exclusives, backroom gossip. Those who didn't were exiled and forgotten. And so, the machine rolled on. The most powerful man in the world had the most powerful cover-up in the world, a free press too spellbound or too complicit to speak. Hollywood too helped, the studios, the publicists, and the fixers. Marilyn Monroe was passed between brothers like a state secret, and when she died, the reporters backed off. Everyone knew the names involved, but no one printed them. There were no investigative features on Mimi Beardsley, no exposés on Judith Campbell's mob ties, no questioning of Pamela Turner, who sat outside Jackie's office by day and walked into Jack's room by night. When the cracks began to show, when rumors spilled into private parties and whispers reached editors' ears, the strategy shifted. They didn't deny, they diminished. Oh, that's just Jack being Jack. Who hasn't had a mistress? He's under pressure. Let him have his fun. The framing was always the same. Women as accessories, distractions, jokes. Never as victims, never as humans. And so the reporters kept typing speeches, dinner menus, and photo ops. They turned their backs on the real story and called it objectivity. But history doesn't forget what the headlines erased. When the women finally spoke, Decades later, they weren't met with gratitude. They were accused of being unstable, opportunists, liars. The journalists who had once failed to protect them now failed to believe them. They said the women were remembering wrong, that they were bitter, or that it had been a different time. For decades, these women's names were scrubbed from the narrative, deleted from the margins of history books, omitted from documentaries, never spoken aloud at commemorative events. The man who had taken from them was celebrated as a visionary, a martyr, an American prince. And still, they endured. Mimi Beardsley held her silence the longest. She was 19, swept into the White House like a ribbon in the wind. She thought she was going to learn how government worked. Instead, she was shown how it breaks people. I was literally swept off my feet. I wasn't ready. I was completely unready for the world I was stepping into. There was no talk of choice or pause for consent, just presence, his, then hers. There was no discussion, there was no conversation, there was no sense of, do you want to do this? He never kissed her on the mouth or made her feel seen, but she saw him clearly even then. He never kissed me on the mouth, ever, not once. Diana DeVegh was 20 when it began. She thought she had been chosen. She later realized she had been available. At the time, I thought I was special. Now I know I was just convenient. He was 43, married, powerful. She was idealistic, isolated, and flattered into submission. I didn't realize for a very long time that I had been invisible to him the whole time. There was no breakup or confrontation, just absence. When it ended, there was no conversation. I simply stopped being invited. Judith Campbell Exner had been glamorized and vilified, but never protected. She was passed between a president and a mob boss. She delivered sealed messages because she was told to, because she was in love, because she didn't know how dangerous the world around her had become. He told me he trusted me. That's why he asked me to deliver the envelope. He said it was just easier that way. When the story came out, she was treated as a liability. I never lied. I protected him because I loved him, and he didn't protect me. When everything fell apart, I was the one left holding the shame. He was gone. The others denied me. I was just there. Mary Pinchot Meyer couldn't be quoted. She was silenced before she had the chance. But those who knew her remembered what she said and what she feared. Jack is changing. He's opening up. There's more he wants to say. But they won't let him. And then she died. 2 bullets, no suspects, a diary taken by the CIA. After Mary's suspicious murder, Timothy Leary, Meyer's informal guide, claimed she visited him. She told me she was going to blow the lid off Washington. She said the system was rotten and she had proof. But her voice was stolen. Pamela Turner never spoke, not in public, but a former colleague recalled, Pam knew her role. She was the one who never made a fuss, never made a scene. That's why she lasted. And in the only words ever attributed to her, spoken off the record, she drew the line that still stands. I will never speak about my time in the White House. Not then, not now. It's finished. They weren't looking for justice. It never came. They weren't chasing fame. Fame had already used them. All they wanted was the record corrected, their names remembered, their pain believed, because this was never a story about misbehavior. It was about a machine, a presidency powered by a system that summoned, used, and erased women without consequence. So what does it say about us that we called that Camelot? What does it say about a nation when charm becomes power's most reliable alibi? And what do we owe to the women whose stories were too inconvenient to include the first time? This isn't about erasing a president. It's about restoring the women he tried to forget. He could have been great, and that's what stings the most. Beneath all the brilliance and promise was a man who chose the mask over the truth, and left others to pay the price for it.